Yeah, there's more seats, so if you want a seat, I think there's even a couple more that Betsy's got here. So thanks, everybody, for coming out. It's really great to be here. And
Be careful behind you, right? Yes.
if you hear me talking loudly, it's because I've been instructed to do so, because I have to project. I'm not being amplified. So just let me know if you can't hear me. I want to thank, obviously, Stephanie for inviting me to come speak, as well as Betsy, who both have been really instrumental, and as particularly Betsy with your help even up to the very end. So thank you very much. So I should start by saying that I interpreted the invitation to come speak about the collection as an opportunity to be indulgent in the leaps of associative thought that my brain tends to make when I look at art. So hopefully I'll be invited back. What this means is that the structure of the talk and the decision to talk about multiple works today through a tour, which I hope you'll all, again, indulge me with, rather than just a single piece, reflects my tendency to view artworks in relation to one another rather than isolated visual events. I think this is especially true when it comes to historical works, such as the ones I'm going to talk about in the collection today. And you'll probably notice that I tend to focus on a story or history that I feel is present in a work without necessarily being visible. This too is a reflection of my process as an artist, which is a filter that doesn't really turn off when I'm looking at other artists' works. To that end, I think it's probably helpful to say a little bit about my own work, which for the past several years has included research as a fundamental part of my working process. Many times this isn't fancy or difficult. It's just time-consuming, and means reading a lot of articles and books and online, the internet, essentially. But other times, it is more intensive and extensive, including working with archivists, historians, archaeologists, which Stephanie alluded to, and other non-artists whose expertise is often brought to work or brought to bear on the material works that I eventually make. So whether I'm reading, writing, or finding myself compelled to travel to particular sites to discover something firsthand, I'm usually guided by an intuitive process, but one that uses the complications of truth, narrative history, and place as focal points. So in terms of subject matter, I spend a lot of time thinking about how social relations, particularly those involving race, the body, politics, intersect with and impact the natural and built environment. And I'm particularly intrigued when I discover fictions that have been made into public monuments or bubble up in public rituals and pastimes. So currently, as Stephanie said, I'm working on this public art commission with poet Kaya San. It takes the form of an artist residency with the City of Portland Archives and Record Center. And we've been engaging these surveillance documents collected by the Portland Police on different activist groups over a 30-year period. Ultimately, the material works we make will become part of the city's permanent public art collection. And I note that because it's administered by RAC, or the Regional Arts and Cultural Council, and funded by Portland Percent for Art, which kind of leads into my segue into talking about this work. So are folks familiar with Percent for Art? Yes. Dwayne, do you want to just give us a synopsis about Percent for Art?
There's a state law that required any public buildings have to spend 1% of the total price of the building on public works of art.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to be relying on you, it sounds like today. It's like encyclopedic knowledge over here. So when I came across this work by Bunce, it triggered several things for me. So for one, what you see on the placard here, it's clearly labeled as a Works Progress Administration, or WPA, Oregon WPA Art Project, which is now an umbrella term for a host of buildings, artworks, projects that either were funded, subsidized, commissioned, or bought by the federal government during a 10-year period as part of FDR's New Deal program from 1933 to 1943. As a response to the Great Depression, which was triggered by the stock market crash in 1929, this program employed millions of people, mostly unskilled workers, and a smaller, more well-known part of the program included the employment of artists, musicians, actors, directors, that did a whole host and range of projects, including individual works of art, like the one here, that were bought or commissioned to adorn federal and public buildings and structures across the country. So it's here that we see the first incarnation of a percent for art program, right? And as well as both relief and non-relief programs aimed at putting artists to work. So Louis Bunce, who I've been told is how we like to be announced, or the name that he would go by, took part in multiple of these programs of the WPA, including a mural he painted for a post office in Grants Pass, Oregon, which is pictured on this postcard here. So I'm going to pass these around, and feel free to take one. I think we're good. I think everybody can have one. Yeah. Yeah, I've got more. Oh, sure. Okay, thanks. Yeah, all right. So the one that's circulating around is called Rogue River Indians, and it was in 1938 with tempera. And I wanted to show this because I think it's fitting, as many scholars recount the creation of the WPA being heavily inspired and influenced by the work of Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. So the first mural that Rivera completed in the US was at the Pacific Stock Exchange building in San Francisco. And it was this work, along with others that Rivera created, especially the Detroit industry murals, celebrating workers in industry at the Ford Motor Company, that later inspired FDR's New Deal work programs. So similar programs employing artists, such as Rivera, had already been taking place in Mexico after the Revolution of 1910. But the contrast in politics behind and depicted in the murals of Rivera could not be starker. Rivera was a Marxist, a member of the Communist Party, whose wife Frida Kahlo was him and his wife were, Frida Kahlo were politically active throughout their entire lives. And the political motivation behind Rivera's work is highlighted in a mural commission, which I'm going to grab here, he received for the Rockefeller Center. So I'm going to go ahead and do that one. And this was in New York City, and Rivera was given the theme, Man at the Crossroads, looking with hope and high vision to the choosing of a new and better future. That's another mouthful. The mural was never completed or shown, as Rivera had depicted a figure with the recognizable face of Lenin, which is very small and very hard to see, but it's down there in the right-hand corner, sort of under that wing. You may be able to make out the impressions of it. So there's the face of Lenin holding hands with a multiracial group of workers, and although Nelson Rockefeller approved Rivera's central composition contrasting capitalism and socialism, Rivera was asked to remove the face of Lenin, which wasn't indicated in his submitted design. Okay, but he refused. He thought it would be too great of a compromise. He did offer to depict and paint in Lincoln as a contrasting American figure, but the offer was rejected, and production was ordered to come to a halt. So I think it's interesting and worth noting that Rivera was feeling a lot of social pressure at the time, and he responded by inserting Lenin. So what basically happened is some of the newspapers got wind of him painting this mural. He was already a controversial figure. It kind of was a recipe for disaster from the get-go, okay? And so when the papers started saying things like anti-capitalist communist propaganda being in the house of the Rockefellers, Rivera was also getting criticism from leftist colleagues and artists who were like, you're a sellout, essentially, right? What are you doing this for the Rockefellers? So on one hand, leftist leanings on one side are telling him, you know, this is not strident enough work in terms of its political stance, and the other, he's being billed as this communist. So he's like, he sees that in the paper, he's like, you want communism, I'll show you communism. That's when he actually inserted the Lenin figure, okay? Is after it became a kind of public discussion, and he figured he would make it a truly communist work. So in the Workers' Age paper of 1933 that you see there, it states, it's very hard to read, so I'll read it to you. This unusual photograph and the detailed photos printed in this section were taken surreptitiously by one of Rivera's aides after the Rockefellers had forbidden the completion of the mural, or even its reproduction or photographing. unfortunately, a good third of the main wall and both side walls are not included. The parts cut off due to the technical difficulties of photographing include an unemployment demonstration with police just starting to break it up, part of the war scene, the student scene, part of the May Day demonstration, a group of workers issuing from their factory and listening to a working class propagandist. The sidewalls contain pictures showing the liquidation of religion and the liquidation of tyranny. A description of the plan of the picture is contained in Diego Rivera's article. So it's quite a lot that's going on in that work. But despite protests and requests to have it removed moved to the Museum of Modern Art, it was covered and destroyed. A later work was commissioned and placed in the location of the intended Rivera mural, which was entitled American Progress by Jose Maria Sert, which placed Lincoln as the central character. And using only the surviving black and white photos taken just before its demolition, Rivera then recreated the mural with some alterations in Mexico. Okay, so that's kind of the backstory to then talk about this work at Bunce, as well as other artists in the WPA collection here at the museum. And I'd like you to take notes at the differences in the representation of labor and laborers between American artists with the work of Rivera. Okay, so in the Bunce work, which I love, this painting, we see, actually there's only one figure, right? Sort of solitary, stark figure. And there's this great use of shadow. I love the composition. And in Bunce's own words, it's still marked in part by a sense of desperation that was indicative of the time.
Did you choose your shirt so that you could blend in?
Oh, I didn't even think about that, but maybe subconsciously, yeah. So in an interview that Bunce gave just a year before he passed away in 1983, he provided insight into his role involved with the WPA, as well as the factors that played into the shift of his style. He clarified that some works were made and then purchased by the Treasury Department, so sort of independently, and then they said, we want that one. And some were commissioned, such as the mural in 1983 that I showed you. He described his work at the time and noted that he'd been influenced by surrealist painters in New York, most notably the metaphysical paintings of Giorgio de Chirico. And I think you can see this influence in this painting, which, like I said, I think is great. I like this skeletal structure. It seems to be a scaffold for potentially a sign work.
Did De Chirico do the one with the little kid rolling the bicycles going along and the little kids going behind it? You have that same, the sunset with the spokes.
I'm not sure I recall that exact work. Does anybody?
It's yellow, it's very yellow.
There's a big shadow.
Yeah, with the shadow of the little kid running.
Do you know the name of it?
I believe that's what it is, yeah. I don't know the name of the picture.
Okay.
That might be the Greek,
The Greek?
maybe.
Okay.
But it's the same idea.
Yeah, and so you also have some slippage going on between, what's foreground, what's background. There's some play going on with that, which I think is really interesting. And if we take into account Bunce's biography and his predilections as an artist, it all makes sense, right? So he was from this area, but as Dwayne mentioned, schooled in New York when I had a short conversation with him before, came back to Portland after success in New York. And so he has a huge career, which I hadn't actually been that aware of until starting to research this. Very wide-ranging work. And, but we start to see that it's guided more by a set of aesthetic principles in reactions to art movements of the day, right? So he's not guided by this overall sense of political ideology or leanings. Therefore, at times, the work shares kind of the aesthetics of social realism and Mexican muralist traditions, but only so long as it seems relevant, right, within his own social circle and relevant on a sort of larger scale and dialogue. And so that's why I think it's interesting to see that mural, and you can kind of see the visual similarities with the mural that he did in Grants Pass. Yeah.
We just had the triptych, which you might have seen in the center, that they had the Francis Bacon that had that same sort of big scaffolded architectural structure, and then had Lucien Freud sitting in it, and it was a portrait of him as sort of like thinking that architecture, so that it was like Lucian Freud and Francis Bacon were both these master architects in their painting, whereas this one has, it's the sun just casting the shadows.
Yeah.
So it's like there's no person there thinking that it's sort of a war between nature and whoever the builder was, that nature actually maybe does the better little scaffolding with all the diagonal lines from the shadows.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting interpretation. I think that's just it. I don't think I'm coming down one way or another as, certainly not, saying, okay, it's a critique that he doesn't have, the same ideology of Rivera. I just think it's interesting to see, how do these structures, the machines, the buildings, the architecture, the use of figures, how might they just show up in kind of relief to, say, the work of Rivera, which just seems so politically motivated.
Isn't it Shaler who does all the smokestacks in the background? Like that too?
No, you got me. I just looked at this one. So let's see. So I kind of arranged this talk so that, again, we could move on to other pieces, because I want to talk about works in relation to one another. And I'm thinking about, I plan maybe 10 minutes here, 5 minutes at each successive one, so we'll end up moving up all the way over to the third floor in the other building, okay? So now I'd like to take us over to the Joseph Stella. And as we move to the other galleries, I really appreciate that you're engaging and just asking questions. I think part of the structure was also thinking we could have bring your chairs with you, and ideally we'll just have a kind of evolving public conversation. And so I'm just gonna jump in. Here's this piece by Stella. Again, I sort of set the stage, I think, to talk about what you guys see in this work. I'll say a few things. I think it's clear that in the work of Rivera, like I mentioned, there's a celebration of labor, the worker, industry, and the monumental structures of the city. For him, I think we're seen as a manifestation of collective social will and power. And when visiting New York, Rivera was enthralled and amazed. As Susan Norwood writes, skyscrapers to him were great testimonials to the powers of construction and works of incomparable beauty. He was enchanted by its steel bridges and concrete highways. He says, "Your engineers are your great artists, and these highways are the most beautiful things I've seen in your beautiful country," he once told his friend Bertram Wolfe. "Out of them and the machine will issue the style of tomorrow," right? So sort of this vision of Rivera on a ship setting sail and him talking about Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Joseph Stella is an Italian-born American futurist painter based in New York City who did a lot of work about the Brooklyn Bridge. And so here, like the Louis Bunce downstairs, you see that Stella is driven less by, say, the social realism of Rivera's intent to demonstrate the power, like I said, of a sort of social capital. He's more influenced by the artistic movements of the time, most notably Futurism, which sought to glorify the machine made in industry. So here in the title, right, and then in the depiction, the machine itself is given humanistic qualities. It is alive, living and breathing at night, factories at night. The workers have either gone home or the night crew is on duty. It's difficult to see what is cloud and what is smoke. And the hint of blue suggests sky and light that is proportional to the beams emanating or emitting from the factory itself. So I'm not really sure about this painting. I'm actually really curious about what you guys think about this. What do you think about the portrayal? I'm not sure if it loses some of its sheen over time. Like, in other words, do you read it and basically think of it as a kind of industrial factory just spewing pollution? Do you sort of think of it in the same way that the futurists thought of it, as a kind of, as a more visionary, or?
What is the date on it?
It's 1936.
Okay.
Yeah.
It has such a draftsman quality. It looks as though he so carefully did it with a ruler and a pencil, and I just noticed drafting aspect of it, it's very much drawing.
But the clouds, there's a cloud, looks almost like there's a ghostly face above the whole thing.
But what do you, I mean, yeah, I agree, but how do you read it? Do you read it as like something that's celebratory now, or do you? But how do you personally see it? Is I guess what I'm saying. I know that Stella sees it that way, but do you see it as basically like, oh, that's toxic waste spewing from it, or
Politically
you see
inspired
it?
person.
Yeah.
You think you okay? Yeah.
Yeah,
So you kind of place yourself in the historical context of when it's made or something.
Communism was very popular at the time. The masses, industrialism, those were the basics of seizing, control, and it was a very popular philosophy.
Yeah. I don't think he himself was actually a communist, though, just like Bunce was not. We're actually going to talk about a later Portland-based artist who was, and I think it's reflected in his work. It's visible in the work. Stella actually went on later to move away from some of the futurist style. I mean, he has some amazing paintings and drawings of the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, I think they're amazing. But as he moved a little bit more away from that style, he was heavily criticized by the futurists and kind of distanced, and he sort of died sadly, without as much recognition as he had received from making this kind of work and from the very pronounced futurist work.
I think it's so hard to look at this today, objectively, and I think so. Of course, we have to think about the historical context in which it was made, and I think it's interesting to think about what it must have been like during that time, how romantic and fantastic it must have been to be part of the Industrial Revolution. And but of course we've had decades since then where like capitalism and industry has left a bad taste in our mouth.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really complex painting to look at today.
Yeah.
Did he go through a
Time-
period?
Yeah.
Did he go through a period of disillusionment with the industrialization?
That's a good question. I mean,
If his content and style changed. Maybe
well,
his
but he
act-
was always fascinated with the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, it was a subject of his work for a really long period of time. So I think he was always still inspired by industry, always inspired by this as a kind of form of landscape. I don't think he really distanced himself from that as much as the aesthetic sensibility maybe shifted.
Because this is really beautiful, all the red, it looks like it's almost the sunset itself. It's the industry as kind of natural force, but we don't see any human figures in it, so we can't see
Yeah.
the workers who are
I love that
who are having the
Yeah. Exactly. And that's why, that's another reason why this one was compelling to me is like, they're not there. There's this kind of a sense of presence that's there, but not at all like the Rivera work or some other social realists, right? Where the figure, the worker is like very prominently displayed.
Also during that time, that was when the idea of industrial shapes were so very exciting because they were big, they were solid.
Uh-huh.
There was a lot of
Geometric.
Yep.
Yep.
So that was
You can't abstract you can abstract the figure the same way, but you can still always have us kind of, you have a different sense of the representation of it, I think, because you kind of tend to project yourself into them.
It's kind of irresistible because it was new as
Yeah.
a subject to do these big shapes.
So we're moving on. And now this piece by Portland-based artist Charles Heaney, I'm sort of starting to now make a transition, right? We walked through the Native American art section. We see ourselves here with a Pacific Northwest artist. And I started to become interested in thinking about representations of the spirit of the Pacific Northwest, right? Which contrasts with representations of Native peoples, which it will be exemplified in the next Price painting that we see. So I think it's interesting to see how the role of, say, Native American artists in the WPA who were less frequently employed functioned differently And so, right, the history of adorning buildings and honoring architecture is obviously quite different than that of say, creating work for ritual, right, and utilitarian use. So here we find ourselves at the Heaney, and he basically, excuse me, kind of finding my spot here. Oh. I think I got something out of order. Anyway, Heaney started as a painter. Like many Oregon artists, he was strongly influenced by his friend C.S. Price. He adopted a lot of Price's themes of a kind of simple life. He had a pretty obsessive dedication to his work. He also, in the WPA, painted several pictures for the Timberline Lodge on Mount Hood, which was a WPA project. And, you know, really from here on out, I'm just kind of having us more observe some of these particular works that I think are in this room that are interesting. So here you start to see, I mean, when I look at this painting, I can't help but think this is so Portland. Like, I feel like there's something about this that seems to kind of embody that spirit of the, yeah, you've got the dog, you've got someone splitting wood. I feel like this is, you know, the back of the Woodsman Tavern or something like that. It seems like it's a scene straight out of Portland today. You've got that contrasted with Buki, who has this owl piece here, as well as Amy Gorham, who has this piece by Solomon. And so I'm not going to say too much, except just that I think as you're walking around these works and seeing the linkages between them, how do the actual materials, the rendering style, how do they start to kind of imbue this sense of the Pacific Northwest? And how is that representation done by artists that are not necessarily Native peoples? That's, I think, is a pretty interesting contrast. I feel like the Buki, again, I feel like I walk through these galleries and there's a sense of a kind of identity of place that's sort of through this different lens of representing otherness or region or place. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What is the story of this image? Because that's out of place.
Yeah. So Gorham was also one of these artists that moved to New York. She went to Pratt and studied there and was influenced by many artists there. But she also had a strong bent towards spirituality in her work. And so it's not that I'm necessarily saying this is iconic Pacific Northwest work. It's more that artists from this region that are tapped to portray and represent the region are markedly different than, say, the Native American artists that are picked to represent, you know, say, their culture or the area, right? There's a very different aesthetic sensibility that I think is interesting. So the other piece that it should be close by is the C.S. Price painting right over here. So the Price piece here, entitled Indian Women and Children, 1938. You know, Price is a pretty iconic regional painter as well. Price's niece, in talking about her uncle, talked about the family being very much situated in this pioneer tradition, described travels from Wyoming up to Alberta, Canada, and then the artist's eventual decision to leave the land and pursue his art. She recalls family encounters with Native Americans on the trail, and that Uncle Clayt, C.S. Price, was a cowboy on the Wyoming range. He had always had 2 saddlebags, one to carry his drawing tools, which seems pretty amazing to think about that, right? So, you know, obviously this is a very stark contrast again, just the way that the representation is taking place. And so, I don't know, I'm not really sure what more to say about it. I feel like it's sort of present in the work. I don't know if anybody has any comments or questions about it, or how they see those, maybe, again, the linkages or dissonance or difference between say, what's happening with the woodcutter or Gorham's work, and then you've got this work by Price. So, yeah.
What kind of instructions did the WPA give out when it hired these artists? What are
Yeah.
the themes, anything suggested?
Well, you know, the reason why I cite, and many scholars cite, Rivera as such a strong influence is because it was very celebratory and many times very nationalistic, right? And so when there are themes of progress, of sort of depicting more or less what is good about American industry, American culture, you do have it, though, dovetailing with the Great Depression, right? In many cases, you've got, you know, a whole range of photographers that are clearly not making warm and fuzzy photographs or serving more of a documentary purpose. I think that C.S. Price may be following in that range. And so I don't really think of what I'm saying as so much, again, a critique of Price so much as sort of indicative of how do we represent this experience of being pioneers, and what does that mean, right? Is Price sort of sympathetic to that portrayal? Is he sort of part of the quote unquote problem in representing that? I mean, I'm not really sure. Again, I'm not sure where I'm situated in that dynamic, and so that's kind of why I'm volleying it back to you guys as an audience to, you know, to sort of join in the conversation. Like, how do you read this image?
Well, this looks almost like fabric. It almost looks like a quilt. The whole thing is in these blocks of color. And so the human figures almost become, you know, pieces of fabric in a larger quilt as a very cloth or a fabric quality.
Yeah. But I mean, I think of it as being very sad, you know, of the figures, but
You know, okay, this was done when, in the 30s?
yeah.
Well, I have to wonder how much effort was being put into forgetting the history of how we treated the first Americans.
Uh-huh.
And because, I mean, like, you look at Ed Curtis in his photographs romanticizing the Native Americans, and almost to cover up the fact that we committed genocide against them.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like, and then when you get into this, you know, socialist movement of the 20s and 30s, it's almost like that was forgotten.
Uh-huh.
You know, I mean, it almost became irrelevant for a period of time, and we're only now starting to remember what that's all about.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, you know, that's why I've been drawn to these works in relation to one another, because I think they start to tease this out, right? Like, in what sense does this federal program help kind of whitewash a certain history, and then are artists implicated in that? Are they separate from it? You know, it's kind of hard to know. Yeah.
The child is in a canoe, a little, it could be a wooden boat, and so there's a sense that, I mean, you could go backwards or forwards. That boat can go either way, so it's kind of an open question. I don't see it so much as sad as kind of somber.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of WPA works were actually, yeah.
It reminds me of the Dorothea Lange
Photographs, yeah.
These were black and white,
Yeah.
scale photograph.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
Did the WPA provide the paints?
Well, a lot of times what they did is they either subsidize actual works or commission them. There was separate programs. Some programs were relief programs, meaning they would put artists to actual work, and others were non-relief, and they were, again, like commissions, or they would pay only a portion of them. So I don't know if that means they bought the materials or what. I just know that, you know, sometimes what they would end up doing is taking a certain percentage, would pay for that, and then actually local agencies or municipalities would have to also take up some of the other costs, somewhere like 25–30% of costs.
It's interesting to consider it in the kind of the legacy or the historical trajectory of Madonna and Child, and I think also Dorothea Lange's migrant mother is part of that motif. To just acknowledge that repetition that continues to endure.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That
Yeah.
Maybe a demonization of Native American men.
Hmm. Hmm.
There's not a man represented.
Right.
In that photo,
Yeah.
in that painting.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned some of the other, murals too that fall in this tradition, like or Thomas Hart Benton's very controversial Indiana murals that, have been criticized for perpetuating, this image of colonialization and of, of Native peoples and things like that. So,
We're really good at rewriting history.
did you want to add something?
No.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you did.
It just looked to me like they've been left behind,
Uh-huh.
and the boat is there and no place to go.
Yeah.
That's how I interpret.
Well, I want to conclude over at the piece right over here, The Homesteaders. Showing this work, it's a good question, showing the work, this betrayal of, showing this directly after the betrayal of Native peoples isn't an accident. But I do aim to show that the work of Rundquist here, Arthur Rundquist, this is Homesteaders from 1939. I think it's more complex once you start to look into the history, which I had a chance to do. So I started to become really interested in these images I came across that aren't in the collection, but show a very markedly different tone and relationship to labor. You could argue that it starts to be present here in this piece. And both Arthur Rundquist and his brother both worked in the Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington during the war effort, right, making victory ships. So Arthur produced many pieces from this time and worked to document the workers of the shipyard. And he's become known for this sort of social commentary. The landscapes in his paintings were second to the people that are featured. And so that's why I want to show you these now. You can go ahead and pass those around. What's circulating is a piece that's actually in the Jordan Schnitzer print collection called Assemblyways, and this isn't from 1944. And like I said, this one in particular has been talked about, but as you start to see in Assemblyways, now it's really clear that Rundquist is a proponent of social realism. He's portraying, right, working there at the shipyard. As it circulates, you'll start to see. And we see this return of the figure, and his intentions about how to portray that figure and the relationship to labor, I think, are undeniable. And again, it makes sense given the history. Now we do have a Portland-based artist working here, politically active his entire life, and was a communist and a Marxist. His different portrayal of labor in works such as Assemblyways and also these two works, which are circulating. On the top of the second card going around, again, you're free to take them, and keep them, is entitled When the Glommer Broke. And then below it is actually a piece that I found through a Kaiser Permanente article about the history, and I actually can't attribute any date but it is definitely noted as being a sketch of an injured worker by Rundquist, which I think is really interesting. So there's no date for that sketch. And what you start to see is, so these works were made when he's a worker there. He's building these warships, and you see this convergence of mass labor and the developer of a worker healthcare system simultaneously. Kaiser's Health Center eventually spawned Kaiser Permanente. It's the same person. And Eleanor Roosevelt, right, was a staunch advocate for these health services. So her visit to Kaiser shipyards initiated the development of these health centers. And you start to see that in that sketch of the injured worker, how necessary when you have the industry and shipbuilding and mass labor taking place at such a massive scale, that you have this convergence of basically a city that needs their workers to be taken care of. What's really amazing is that she was not only a staunch advocate for health services, she continued to advocate for it, and eventually helped Kaiser build them. And she tried to also get Eleanor Roosevelt childcare and meals integrated into the overall health management at these sites, both locally and at a national level. But it was shot down as it conflicted with traditional roles of maternity that were already stressed due to women's employment in the wartime efforts, right? And so, just to give you a little backstory here, I'm going to give you one little snippet here. When Eleanor Roosevelt visited Vancouver in 1943 for the launching of the USS Lauzon Bay, she had a more serious purpose in mind. This is actually, again, I'm taking this little bit directly from one of Kaiser's historical documents. Earlier in the year, she had visited the Portland, Maine shipyards during the graveyard shift, ascending a gangplank to talk to women welders working on platforms 4 feet above ground. She listens as they describe their problems as working mothers. Their difficulty of their dual roles strengthened her conviction that day nurseries and play schools should be located at factories and shipyards where mothers worked. But public opinion was not on Eleanor Roosevelt's side. Fierce objection arose over the idea of working mothers. New York Mayor Fioria LaGuardia opined, "The worst mother is better than the best institution." Even the lone woman member of President Roosevelt's cabinet objected to the development of daycare centers. With so much opposition, only 6 government-sponsored daycare centers were built. But she was, undeterred by this. She did have a center built at the Kaiser grounds. Architect George Wolfe's unique octagonal building design was praised by Architectural Record and Parents Magazine. Its 15 playrooms surrounded a central outside playground. Children's bathrooms were equipped with child-sized toilets and wash basins. A doctor and one or more nurses staffed an infirmary. And again, due to Roosevelt's urging, Edgar Kaiser implemented another innovation, pre-cooked meals for mothers to take home at the end of their shifts. But protests arose, for example, from Multnomah County, the U.S. Children's Bureau, the Oregon State Medical Society, later to become the Oregon Medical Society, on the grounds that childcare centers would encourage mothers to work outside the home, an idea at odds with the idealized notionhood of motherhood at the time, right? So, when I look at that work there by Rundquist, I can't help think, okay, we have this return, right? This sort of full cycle where it's very obvious, mainly because of his class difference in background, being much more modest and being rooted in a working class background and actually working at these shipyards. He was more inclined to represent them differently, right? From a much more different kind of experiential level. And I think that also means that even myself, I love the WPA and its history, but I also have these conflicts. I think FDR was one of the greatest presidents. He's often noted by scholars as like one of the top 3. But he also initiated the internment of Japanese Americans in 1942, which I have a personal family history with as well. So I've got this connection between the WPA on one hand and this other very kind of deeply troubled sort of personal history. And I oftentimes, I think by making this sort of full circuitous route, I'm trying to show that a lot of times those are impossible to kind of break apart, right? So one of the things I was going to leave you with is the last postcard is sort of funny, depressing. I don't know how you want to take it, but it's a shot of the Pacific Stock Exchange, which is there in San Francisco, the site of the first Diego Rivera mural. But it's now an Equinox Fitness Center. It's been bought. The stock exchange building was no longer in use by the mid-'80s, and it was converted to an Equinox Fitness, so that's now where the home of the first U.S. mural resides. And so one of the questions I leave you guys is, conclusion. There it is. So who are today's social realist artists? What would a revival of social realism in painting or contemporary art look like today? What would be the representative industry, and what does the labor of the workers in this industry entail? And lastly, what economic desperation needs to be present in order to have artists turn their attention to issues of class, labor, and politics that extend outside their own discipline and community? So that's, yeah.
Is there any artist today that is doing that kind of work?
I don't know. I think that's a question I'm asking. I mean, I think I'm, I mean, it's partly a rhetorical question. I mean, I'm not really sure. You know, I think there are artists that I think are doing some pretty interesting things that, there's this artist, Tanya Bruguera. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She's been doing this project called Immigrant Movement International, which is essentially a political party that she's founding. So she's kind of using the idea of a political party to more or less make an art project. And so there's trappings of, I don't know, certain bureaucracies and sort of on the ground organizing that take place. And it starts, I think the reason she's doing is it starts to beg the question of if certain kind of realities for a lot of people aren't possible in the real world, like can they be manifested through something symbolic like art? You know, there's another artist, Carolyn Woolard in New York City, who I think is doing interesting work around, you know, again, some issues around housing and development and workspaces for New York City-based artists. She's trying to form a land trust so that instead of, you know, buying into the mass sort of investment in property, that she's more or less creating a collective space that will be preserved in perpetuity for artists to work at. I mean, you know, I guess I'm just kind of just throwing a question out there. I mean, I'm not really sure. I don't know what it would look like in painting, and maybe that's why I shouldn't, you know, even say contemporary art. But I'm kind of interested in, like, if we continue this pictorialist tradition, you know, what would that look like? Would it look heavy-handed and be kind of something that we already are used to seeing and we know it already? Or, I mean,
I think it's your interpretation of what the workforce is, right? And how
Yeah.
you think it's represented in whatever you're looking at.
yeah.
This doesn't seem to me social realist. It seems very idealistic, almost an American version of Adam and Eve, where their labor is so natural that they're just sort of, you know, picking the natural abundance to use for human productivity. Even the deer is just standing there, part of it. They're so one with nature.
Right.
So it seems to me sort of so idealistic that it.
And yet the other three works by him are not. And they're not WPA works, those three, actually. This is the one that's a WPA work. But the other three are by Runquist, done in a social-realist style, that are less idealistic, that definitely show people getting injured on the job, and they're not WPA
Because
pieces.
even the ladder seems like this ladder up to heaven.
Yeah,
It's striking.
yeah.
The WP had a resettlement program in which they took people from the city and taught them to build houses and resettle in the countryside. And they did this with thousands of people, so it looks to me like a document of that.
Oh, okay, uh-huh. Yeah, I wasn't sure because it says homesteaders, and I wasn't sure because it says homesteaders, and when Runquist talks about this, he doesn't necessarily talk about it in relationship to that, but that's really interesting. Yeah. Do you know what the name of that was? I mean,
I don't know what it was called, but it was, I know out of Chicago, they took a lot of people and resettled them through on farms.
yeah, that's
Right.
amazing.
Training.
Like, I think that stuff is just amazing.
To answer your question about the current political visual art, that is, I would say at the moment, the exclusive domain of the graffiti artists.
I was gonna say Banksy.
Banksy and Shepard Fairey.
I was thinking about that today too, and I wondered about that.
And I mean, like, there have been a lot of poster shows over like people's art over Pioneer Place, and that's one thing that has come out is that that is still a theme that has been embraced by the graffiti artists.
So here's the follow-up question. When it comes to graffiti art and the distinction between that and high art, is it still rooted in a class issue? Maybe in the way that the distinction between some of Runquist's sketches in the shipyard versus, you know, different
It's a
sense.
pretty gray area because if you saw Exit to the Gift Shop,
Yeah.
the whole issue became obfuscated
Yeah,
by the
of
amount
course.
of money that was
Yeah, that's good.
injected
Yeah.
into a show of graffiti art.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking maybe less about Banksy than about, you know, it on a populist level where there's not sort of name recognition.
I
and
think more
notoriety.
Shepherd Ferry is more connected.
It's a big industry around that too, but yeah.
Money blurs everything,
Yeah.
and I think that's the problem right now.
Well, and these artists, I mean, a lot of them were paid very, very little.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, they were, you know, they were just getting by. Yeah. I mean, when you hear folks like Runquist or Bunce, for that matter, I mean, very frugal living situations. Same thing with Price. I mean, I don't think any of the artists I talked about
They
were.
never made any money while they were
No.
they were aging.
No, because some of these were relief programs too, so it did mean that they were actually getting employment because they were unemployed. I mean, they had no money, right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So by 1943, the program's dissolved because of the increased war efforts. The employment situation was radically different. Yeah. Do you guys have any questions or I mean?
Down to the cafe.
Okay. Yeah.
For me, and we continue over the afternoon.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.